Hello and welcome to this session on financial modelling with UK banking industry data. In this session, we're going to look at how to take income statement and balance sheet data for 4 UK banks at Barclays, Citi, HSBC and Lloyds and turn it into a financial reporting solution in Power BI. We're going to look at how we can create a benchmarking report from this data, so to compare the banks and see how they do against various ratios such as loans to deposits and cost income ratio. We're going to look at creating an income statement and balance sheet for each bank and linking the income statement and balance sheet together through retained earnings. And lastly, we'll also look at what if scenario modelling, so look at things like headcount growth and loans growth or deposits growth to see what impact that has on the financial statements of the various banks. So just a little bit about me. My name is Rishi Supra. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. I work at a company called Avanade, which is a joint venture between Accenture and Microsoft. I focus on Power BI and look at how to get Power BI adopted at scale in large organisations. That's my primary area of focus. In the community, I run 2 main communities at the moment, one called Power Platform Finance, which is all about helping finance professionals to implement the Power Platform in their roles, and I'm a chartered accountant by background myself. And the other platform is Learn Data Insights, LDI, and that's all about helping people to prepare for Microsoft exams with quizzes and courses, and also use self-paced e-learning and lots of different learning formats coming in there as well. So do please check out their sites. You can also check out my website, rishisupra.com, and it has recordings from past sessions that I've done for communities, meetups, conferences and things like that. So what we're going to build is this kind of solution here. So I'll show you the solution first. And actually, let's come back to this. Let me show you some of the data. So this is some of the data that we'll be working with. So we've just got an Excel file that's got for all of the banks on here. So all of the 4 banks, we can see Barclays, Citi, HSBC and Lloyds. For the financial statement lines, so balance sheet and income statement, these are the actual accounts. So this is our kind of trial balance for each year. So we've got assets, liabilities in the balance sheet. We've got income and expenses in the income statement. And then we've got years going along the top here, 2014, 15, 16, 17 and 18. And if you've seen any of my other sessions on financial reporting or looked at some of the other sessions in the community on how to build P&Ls, income statements, balance sheets, things like that in Power BI, you'll know that actually it's a much better approach to take is rather than just using these, is to also have our own layouts for our financial statements. So we have a table that I call FS lines, and this has the layout that we want for our balance sheet and for our income statement. And it includes things like totals, which you wouldn't see in your trial balance there. So we've got things like balance sheet totals, we've got profit after tax, income statement totals. We can have things like gross profit in here, gross margin. We can have calculations. We can have all sorts of things in here. But this allows us to be able to drive actually what type of rows we have on our financial statements, whether they are just coming straight from lines that we have in our chart of accounts, or in this case, just straight from our trial balance, or whether we actually need to do a calculation. And that's what this calc type column here refers to. So here we're looking at a calc type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. And these different calc types are saying, okay, well, calc type 1 is where these lines here, trading portfolio assets, derivatives, these come straight from our source data. So this is one of the lines that we'll see here in our income statement or balance sheet accounts. So actually we don't need to do anything apart from just sum the numbers. So that one is quite easy. It's just standard. It's a financial statement line. Number 2 is a subtotal, and we've got subtotal of the same category. So total assets, total liabilities, total equity. And then on the balance sheet, so in income statement, we've got total income and total operating expenses. So these are subtotals. So this is the total of all the lines which are categorized as assets. These are all those which are categorized as liabilities and so on. We've also got subtotal 3, calc type 3, and this is actually a subtotal of all the lines above it in the corresponding financial statement. So net income is just a sum of all of the lines, excluding subtotals, of the lines above it in the income statement. Same with P&L before tax and profit after tax. And then retained earnings is the same thing as well, as underneath at the bottom after dividends. We then have Calc Type 4, and Calc Type 4, we can see here, is our calculated fields. So at the moment, we've only got calculations on the balance sheet. As I say, you can have things like gross margin, net margin, utilization, whatever percentages you want to show on your income statement or balance sheet, you can have as calculations. So we have a calculation for our balancing figure to make sure that our balance sheet balances. We have a calculation for average equity and then calculation for total liabilities and equity. We then have modeled FS line. So this is where we are actually going to model these with what if scenario modeling. So we'll look at this towards the end of the session, but we actually want to do what's our in loans, our loans value and our deposits and our staff costs. Those are lines that we want to actually look at. What if we actually increased our staff costs? What if we had an X percentage increase in headcount over the next year, or decrease even? And lastly, we've got Calc Type 6 is just retained earnings, and we need to just have this as a separate calculation just in order to avoid any circular dependencies. And this is something you'll come across quite a bit when you try and link these kind of financial statements together, is this issue of circular dependency. So one way I've got around that here is by actually putting retained earnings, which does link into both balance sheet and income statement as its own calculation type. So we have all of these lines here with their own calculation types. We just have the ID here, and then we have the calc types there. We also have just a list of categories. So in what order do we want our headings to be able to appear? So again, it's very important to have these in the FS lines, to have a number, an order number. So this is the order that they will appear in, because the order of the financial statements is also very important. So that's the data. And if I now switch to what our solution could look like. So let's just bring up the example here. So we start with a benchmarking report. So we're looking at Barclays, Citi, HSBC and Lloyds, and I've used these colours consistently throughout the charts. So we're looking at this for a given metric for the benchmark analysis. So we can choose the metric here. Do we want to look at current ratio, which is your assets to your liabilities? How much can the bank fund its assets as current assets? Its current liabilities with its current assets. So then we've got things like loan to asset ratio. So loans are obviously a source of assets for a bank, a retail bank. But what proportion does loans take up compared to the other assets on its balance sheet? We've got things like net income growth. And from here, we're starting with a point of 0. So everything starts at the same point in 2014. That's the first year of our data. And then we can much easier compare from that point up until 2018. How have they compared? And they all seem to have followed a very similar trends there for net income. And then we can see underneath, we've got then broken down by year as well. We can see the small multiples here by the different banks. And then we can plot the different points by year. And we can see, the trend in HSBC tends to be, that we had an anomaly here for HSBC in 2016 in terms of net income growth, or whatever we've got selected. And here we're comparing it to average equity. So we're using average equity there as a bit of context, because that average equity is its capitalization, which is funding or the things behind these ratios essentially. How are they being funded? So we're really looking at performance here and looking at how to compare performance across them. So we've got there also return on assets. And we can see then the banks that we're comparing. And if we wanted to just compare a subset of those banks, if we wanted to make those graphs less cluttered and only compare some of them, we could just pick particular banks that we want to select there. So this is our benchmarking report. And if we're then specifically interested perhaps in going down, we could right click and drill through into Barclays specifically and look at the financial statements. So here then we have, for any given bank, we have their income statement and the balance sheet. Right, let me just bring this FS lines back again to get it returned the right order. So here we've got our income statement, we've got returns. This is your income for retail bank, cost of funding, and then total income. So this is your net income, if you like, there. Oh, actually, net income is here after credit impairment and provisions. And then we have staff costs. And this is just highlighted a different colour because it's something that we're going to be modelling. Not at this stage, but in the end. Then we've got non-staff costs, and then we've got operating expenses here as a total. And then P&L before tax, which is our total income, our net income, less all of our expenses there. So we've got a P&L before tax. And then we've got our tax, profit after tax, and then dividends. And then our retained earnings is our profit after tax after dividends have been taken out. And this is what goes into the balance sheet. So once we have retained earnings, so our net profit and all our money left over after everything has gone out, goes onto our balance sheet as an accumulated asset, essentially, or equity, essentially, that we can maintain in the account. So it's a source of funding for future operations in the business. So then if we look at balance sheet, we've got our assets, and we've got all of our different loans. So loans for retail bank are an asset. We've got our other assets there as well. And then deposits are a liability for retail bank. So here we've got deposits, and then debt are our other deposits, convertibles. And then we have our total assets and total liabilities. And we make sure that we have our total liabilities and equity is equal to our total assets. So 2349642 is equal to our total liabilities and equity. And you can see here the retained earnings coming in, the cumulative profits that we've earned over the years has been built up here in our retained earnings account. And this is important to make sure that our total liabilities and equities do balance, because all of our assets need to be funded either by liabilities, by debt, or by equity, by shareholders' funds and retained earnings. So this number we need to make sure balances, and we do have a balancing figure in here. Given that this is mock data, you wouldn't expect it necessarily to balance by itself. So this is a calculation that we've done here to make sure that our balance sheet balances. And again, the two lines we've got here in yellow are those that we're modelling. And we've got this for every single bank, HSBC, Lloyds, and we can go in and look at the income statement and the balance sheet. And then lastly, we've got financial statement modelling. So what we're looking at here is then saying, okay, well, this is our original. These are our income statements or balance sheets, in this case, originally for Barclays. And then let's have a look at the what-if scenario modelling. So what if we grew loans by 50%? And let me just take these panes out so we can read those numbers a little bit clearer. We can see here actually our numbers are now 53% higher. So we've gone from 693 to 1 million of loans in 2014, and then we can see the corresponding impact that would have on your all your end numbers, your liabilities and equity, and we can compare them. We can compare ratios, and same things with deposits growth. So now we can see the deposits numbers changing as we increase. So from 1371, and we're saying year-on-year growth in the modelled scenario is actually 25% higher, and same with income statement. We could look at, again, here, the ones we're modelling here is staff costs. So we're saying actually if we have a headcount growth of 72%, what impact will that have on our staff costs? What impact will that have on retained earnings and then our balance sheet as well? So we've got some what-if scenario modelling. We could also extend this with actually capturing these scenarios and these parameters using something like Power Apps and linking it to a database. And perhaps that will be another session in itself, given there's a lot to ground to cover here in terms of how to build this solution. So let's go back now to some of the slides, and I'll show how we're building the solution. So this is the actual solution. So the 4 steps that we take to build a solution is the first, that we ingest and model our data. So we take those Excel files, we bring them in to Power BI desktop, and we just create the relationships we need between our tables. We then need to build all the measures and build the financial statements using the native matrix visual here. We then calculate our ratios and build our benchmarking page, and then we create the what-if parameters for scenario modelling. So if we now then look at the first step, which is ingesting and modelling data. So what we need to do here is, the first thing is we're not going to connect to Excel files stored on my machine. That's generally bad practice, and it is the default for when you connect to an Excel or CSV file, but actually it's much better to store them, say, on the Teams channel, where they can then be accessed via SharePoint. And that way they can be accessed through a cloud source, and your machine doesn't need to be turned on or have a gateway installed at the time of refresh, and other people can access it. We need to unpivot that data, because if you remember, we had the years along columns. We want to bring all of those back into a single column year, create some dimensions, and then have our fact table just as dimension keys and values. And we looked to this FS lines table previously. This is what we're going to bring in. And if you remember, this is a manually created table. It's something we just created in Excel as a metadata table, a helper table, in order to help us say, well, these are the rows that we want on our financial statements. And this is the corresponding calculation type. It's either an FS line that's coming straight from our trial balance, or it's a subtotal, or it's a calculated, or it's a modeled line. So let's go back and do a demo of this now. So if we now have a look at step 1, and I'll just open up here. So we store the files on Teams, and actually I'll just go back and show how we can do that. If I open up Teams, we've got a Teams channel here called Financial Reporting Workshop, and I've just uploaded them here into Banking Solution. And then what I can do is go into here, open in SharePoint, and it will open up a link where I can then access that from a SharePoint site and put the URL into our folder here. So this is the URL that it opens up in SharePoint. This is my Teams channel, so anything I save into Teams will be stored here, and then we can access our files from here. So this is our bank data that's taking this as a staging query and opening it up and just importing the worksheets. And I've got the hat symbol here as a prefix to indicate these are staging queries. These are queries that just connecting to that SharePoint URL, bringing in the data from here, but not applying any transformations for these different metrics. So I then use, and they're all disabled load. It's their staging queries. We don't need to bring them into our data model. And I've then grouped a series of queries under the transform folder, under the query group. And this is referencing those hat staging queries and then merging them in. So here we're bringing in the calc types, and I'm also then bringing in the FS line categories. So just to bring in, so we had a few different lines relating to FS lines. We had the FS line calc type ID, and this had the calc type descriptions with the color codes that we want for them as well. And we can use these for formatting. And then we also brought in the category number, so the sort order for those. So I've just merged those into a single FS lines table. There's no point having 3 separate kind of dimension tables here for our FS lines. We might as well just have one. So just merged it into one, and that's better performance. For our bank data, we've taken that data and applied an unpivot other column step. So we've taken where we had years across columns and unpivoted it. So now we've got year as a single column here. And if you've worked with this kind of data in Power BI before, you'll know that this is a much better format. It allows us to be able to slice and dice it by year rather than having to create separate measures for each year and making our DAX really complex. So just having our data in the right shape here is really important. And that's what we've got here then. We've got loaded in. We've just created a dimension table just using enter data for the years. So now we can join our years back on there into that column. We've got also just, again, a bank ID, a bank. So we've got our banks there just entered in as a manual table. And when we then have our FS lines, we've just applied the mergers back to the bank table, to the years table, to just bring in the FS line number and the bank number that we're going to put in. So in terms of our accounts data, this is our actual fact table. So we've got the FS line number, the bank ID, the year, and the value. So this is all we need in our fact table, are just the FS line number, the bank ID, which relates to banks here, the year, and then the value. So we load that in, and once we put it into Power BI, we then have our data. It's a very simple data model here that we can just join up. So we've got years going into, we've got headcount metrics as well. We'll come back to that one, but we've got years going into here. We've got banks going into accounts data, FS lines going into account data. And actually, I think this one should be year onto year here as well in the actual model. So now we've got a relationship there. So I think that one was just missing from this particular instance of the file. We've got years joining onto our year, banks, bank ID joining onto bank ID, and FS lines joining into FS line number. So our fact table, very simple data model. Headcount metrics, say we'll come back to at a later stage. So if we just go back now and look at what we've got here. So we stored our files on SharePoint or the local drive, unpivoted the years, and just created our fact table with just having our FS line ID, FS line number, our bank ID and year, and then a value. And then we link into this, we bring in this FS lines metadata table to tell us, here's all the different line numbers that we've got. This is the calculation type. Is it just coming straight from our fact table, or are we doing a running total calculation? Are we doing a calculation, or is this something that we want to model? The next step is for us to build the measures that we need now in this Power BI report and then create the matrix visual for the financial statements. So I'm just going to show this and then come back. And actually all of the measures that I've created, I've done using tabular editor scripts because actually they're much easier to be able to do. And I'm using tabular editor 3 here for that. So when in tabular editor 3, we can do a new DAX script and we can just script our measures. And it's connected to the data model. So once it will validate them and apply them, and then we can just actually have them in our model. So here, this is how we create a measure. So we create a new DAX script connected to the Power BI desktop model. Just say measure, give it the table name, and we've got a separate measures table there. Total amount is just the sum of accounts data value. And the advantage of this is it's much, much quicker to create measures this way. And you'll see here, what we can actually have different scripts that overwrite the measures, because what we're doing is building our measures up in stages. And this is really important. We've got really complex measures that kind of chain together. It's much better to be able to use this kind of interface to just create our measures, and then in subsequent scripts, we can then run them in sequence, and they can give you the right measures that refer to others. So what we're doing here is we've got measure total amount is just sum, and we can also put in here display folder FS measures. We can actually put in descriptions, which is a very good thing to have in our models. So rather than doing this all manually in Power BI desktop, we can automate this using tabular editor. So this is a much easier editor to create measures than Power BI desktop, and well worth the investment for tabular editor 3. Rather than spending money on lots of training resources, learn how to use tabular editor and become much more productive and efficient, and you'll get that return back easily. So here, this is our base measure we can put in here for the calc type FS line. And then we've got display folder. We're just going to put it under FS measures. Now what we want to do is just create our base measure that we're going to use for our financial statement. So this is one is going to be for the type FS line, and let me just put this in single quotes. And then we've got all of the ones where we've got category running totals, FS line running totals, balance sheet, FS modeled value, and retained earnings. So all of these relate to the various calc types. But what I'm doing for now is just creating placeholders for them, just creating them as blank measures. Let's say we will overwrite these later with the right measures in subsequent scripts. But for here, at least we've got the structure that we need for our measures. So we create our FS line value measure. This is actually our measure that we're actually going to use on our income statement and balance sheet. And we say, okay, this FS line value, it's a switch statement. So have a look at what the calc type is in scope, because in each row coming from that financial statements table, there's going to be a calc type description and a calc type in context. So it's either going to be a calc type 1, a calc type 2, a calc type 3. So it looks through all of those lines that's currently in scope of the current row and says, have a look at what that is. If it's FS line, just give us our total amount measure, which is just the sum of the value in the accounts table in our fact table. If it's a subtotal of same category, then use the corresponding measures that we've created here. Now, obviously, initially, this is not going to give us anything because it's just going to give us blank. But we can do that and give us our measures there at least, so we create this structure that we want with the switch statement for FS lines. And we've also just got one there for color to say if it's an FS line, color it white as a background. If it's a subtotal, we want the gray. If it's a modeled line, we want it in that yellow. And then if it's retained earnings, also just color it white. So just to give us our conditional formatting, it's really a good idea to have these as a measure or have these as a column that you can then reference. And this will just go in its own folder called formatting measures. So that's the first script. We can actually just write this script up, save it as a script, and then apply and sync. And we could apply these to any measures that we wanted to. So I haven't actually created the measures table in this particular one, which is why it's giving me an error. So it actually does do some validation as well. This version of the model I'm connected to doesn't have, if I actually connect to a different version, that should have it in there. And let me just open up that file again. So here we have, now it's got a measures table in there, just a blank table. And now this is not giving me any errors, and I can just apply and sync. So I've connected to that version of Power BI Desktop, apply and sync. And if I go back to Power BI Desktop, those measures would have actually all been created in there. So if I actually look at step 2, if I didn't have them in there already, they would already be created. So actually, let me just create this table in here, and I'll show you actually on this particular example. So now if we go to new table, so modeling new table, and we're just going to create a measures table, and I give it a double underscore as a prefix, so it comes right at the top. So we're just going to call it measures, and just going to create a blank table. So we just do blank and put it in curly brackets. That's all we need. This is the easiest way to just create a blank table, a measures table. So now we've got a table in there, and now if we go back to Tabular Editor, let me just connect back to that step 1 file, step 1, and open that file again. So all these files is checking that you actually have a valid model open before it opens that scripts files. But now I can just do apply and sync, or I could actually just select it a little bit and do apply selection sync. But I'll apply this whole model, and now if we go back to our step 1 folder, we should see them come up in there. Let me just check that I've got formatting measures. Here you go, they are there, yeah. So formatting measures and FS measures. So it's created all these measures automatically with that script. So it's a much easier way of creating measures than just going to formatting. So modeling, new measure, and then doing that one by one. Especially because at the moment I'm just creating a whole set of measures just for my structure at the moment. So that's measure script 1. I'm going to now also open up a couple of other measures. So my measure scripts. So measure script 2. This is now then for our category running total. So if you remember, we created the category running total here just as a blank measure. And now we can actually go back, and when we run this script, it will update it to be a proper category running total measure. So the DAX that we need for the category running total is essentially a cumulative total pattern. So we look at what we have selected as our FS line number. So we can see our FS line category, and then we say calculate table, FS lines is less than the selected FS line number. So this is really just a cumulative total pattern. You say what is the number, or what is the date in a traditional cumulative total pattern that's its scope, and then give me in the scope of all of the FS lines. You need to do this to remove the filter context. Give me all of those where the line number is less than the selected. So the way that I've written this here is I've created that cumulative total just using calculate table. So this returns, this is variable, this returns a table of FS lines where the FS lines number is less than the selected. And I can actually use this now, either this total filter, either as part of a second parameter in a calculate, which is why I always like to create my variables with calculate table and then use these as calculate, or I can actually iterate over this table, which is what I'm doing here. So now we've got FS lines category, and now we return iterate over this table, this calculate table, with SUMX. And we say for each of the rows in here, have a look at which of the rows are in there. So you've got FS lines, and you might have FS lines 1 to 5. One of those might be a subtotal, one of those might be a calculated total, and actually we want to be able to include those. So we say, look at the FS lines. If it's an FS line, then we want to use the total amount. If it's a modelled line, we want to use the modelled value. If it's calculated, then we want to use the calculated value. Otherwise, if it's retained earnings, we want to use the retained earnings value. So then it iterates through this table of FS lines, and essentially for each of those FS lines, so for FS line 1, it's a calc type of FS line, it will just give us the total amount 2. If FS line 3 is a calculated value, for example, then it will say total amount for the first line, total amount for the second line. And it comes to the third line, it's a calculated value, and it's an income statement, so it'll give you the income statement calculated value, or if it's a balance sheet, it'll give you the balance sheet calculated value. So we use the SUMX there to be able to then give us a subtotal, a running total. So we use a cumulative total pattern to define the table, and then we use the SUMX measure. And we've got something very similar for all the rest of them. So for the FS line running total, here we're actually just saying it's exactly the same thing, but our line number doesn't have the category in there as well. So the only two differences between those two measures is this one is FS has this line in here as well. In our combined filter, we say our FS line category is for selected categories, so income, expenses, assets, liabilities, and so on. Whereas here we're just saying across the entire financial statement, give me the cumulative total, the running total of all the lines above it. And again, look at what those are. If it's total amount, if it's a calculated value, if it's a modelled value. And remember, these at the moment are still just returning blanks, or for FS modelled value, I think we've just said total amount. So this will, for now, this will return exactly the same value. So that's our two scripts there. And lastly, I'll just show you the script 3 as well, because script 3 is some of the balance sheet measures. And these are a little bit complex because we have to integrate in with the income statement. We have to do things like balancing figures and retained earnings. So these are some of our more complex measures, but the concept is actually very similar. So for total assets, we do exactly the same thing. We say, just give us a table, define a table where we've got calculate table, FS lines where our category is assets, and then perform a SUMX over that table and say, look at what it is. So this is going to give us all our assets lines essentially in the financial statement. And then for the assets lines, if it's just an FS line amount, just give us the total amount. If it's a modelled one, give us the modelled value. You wouldn't have a total under there or any other types of lines in there. Core balance sheet, again the same thing. So that's the display folder. For total liabilities, we use the total liabilities and we exclude the balancing figure from there. And we make sure that we have total liabilities there, and where our FS line number is less than our total liabilities. So again, this is a cumulative total pattern to give us the table that we iterate over it with SUMX, and then return the values on there. And we have to find a format string here, but I'll come back to format strings in a minute. Total equity, similar concept. And then retained earnings, what we're looking at here is firstly looking at the income statement retained earnings. And so we're creating a measure called income statement retained earnings, and again we're saying actually it's a cumulative total of the entire income statement including dividends. We then look at the yearly retained earnings and again calculate the exact value. We've got the prior year retained earnings, so this is going to give us our current year income statement. If you remember, retained earnings is actually a cumulative total of the retained earnings. So we do retained earnings equity, so for our prior year, so now we're saying look at the year that we've got in scope, and we can do min year, and then we look at the cumulative retained earnings. So now for our equity one, we look at the previous year value, and we look at for the retained earnings equity, we look at what it was in the previous year, and we look at that cumulative total and add on the current year total. And lastly, we've got balancing figure. So this is just making sure that we take our total assets, total liabilities and total equities, and then just give us the difference between those. And just in order to make sure that our total assets is equal to our total liabilities and total equities, we have this balancing figure in there as well. And we say just need to be a little bit careful of the circular dependencies here. So the way that we've done these measures, just make sure that we don't have that issue. We then have average equity, which again is looking at your equity in the prior year, equity in the current year, and then just doing the average between them for that calculation. So this is a calculated value for average equity. So this is a calc type 4 there. So current year plus previous year equity divided by 2. So some of these measures look a little bit complex, but actually they follow a fairly similar pattern that we need to apply across those. And then total liabilities and equities is again a calculation, and the balance sheet calculated value is what we're doing here for whether it's going to be either average equity, total liabilities and equity, or balancing figure. So these are our calc types 4. So when we say we've got a calculated FS line calculation type, we say, okay, let's look at what the name of that calculation is, or the name of that line. If it's balancing figure, then we know we need to calculate the balancing figure. If it's average equity, we need to return the average equity measure. If it's total liabilities and equity, we need to return those. So then when we go back to here, we can say it's calculated value, balance sheet calculated value. At the moment we put this to blank, and then we can overwrite that in here where we have our balance sheet calculated value. So if we run these scripts in order, when we run this script first, it's going to create our blank measures. But we can have a look in here. So all of these will be blank, category running total, FS line running total, they're all just blank measures from script 1. Now if we go in here and run script 2, let me just write like this in here, fix that for the minute, and I think we've only got calculated values in our balance sheet, actually none in our income statement. But now I've run this script, and here we can see now these measures are now giving us the script that we had in this tabular editor scripts, and it's formatted correctly as well, and we can add descriptions and comments. So it's a much neater way of writing it rather than trying to use this window in here. So now we've run those, and then also we can then run our script for here. So I think again we need to just change these all to, they're all balance sheet calculated values. It's the only ones we actually have calculations on here. I think in the original version I did put some income statement ones as well, and then try to simplify this a little bit. But you get the idea that once we've run those, we then have in subsequent versions of our data, we then have our measures. So if we look now at say step 2, what we then have, once we've completed a step, is to then have the models completed here. So we've got accounts data, we've got our measures, we've got our FS measures, and we've got all of our values here. So BS calculated value is our switch statement, and then our FS line value is again referring to some of these measures. So this is what we then put this FS line value, look at the calc type, we put that here for income statement, we draw up the matrix. So we've got on our rows, FS line category, FS line, columns year, values, FS line value. And we've got a filter, visual level filter here for balance sheet, and the same thing here for income statement. So this is just a standard native matrix visual that we've just done for a specific bank. It's got the years along the top, and then it's got our income statement and our balance sheet. So the second step here was to build the measures in a matrix visual. So we have the script 1, which is giving us our total amount, our category running total, FS line running total, calculated value. All of these are set to blank in the first script, and then a switch measure for FS line value, switching between the various calc types. We have script 2, which is essentially the cumulative total pattern, where we use calculate table, iterate over the result of it with sum x, and then choose the right totals for there. And then we have script 3 for our balance sheet, where it's again calculate table function for things like total assets and total liabilities. And then for retained earnings, our income statement retained earnings is all our income statement lines above the retained earnings line, and then our balance sheet retained earnings is the cumulative total of these income statement ones. So here's how we're linking things together with these measures that we're creating there. And then we just build the measures in a matrix visual. So both of them have both matrices for their income statement and balance sheet, have FS line, and we don't need FS line number actually, but FS line on rows, the year along the columns, and then FS line value, that switch statement measure, as our values. So that's it for those. Okay, so now we're going to look at the ratios and the benchmarking page. So if we have a look, and we go back to here now. So if we open up measure script 4, so here we have then just some ratios that we're calculating, and these are fairly simple ratios. So we have net income growth. We're looking at the minimum year, and this will pick out 2014 in our current data set. We look at the current year and the previous year value, and then previous year net income is just FS line value, where it's the previous year, and the FS line is net income. Current year net income is calculating it for where the current year, and we're using this FS line value because this has got the switch statement baked into it. So looking at the calc type, if it's just a total line, if it's a subtotal, and so on. Then we say if the current year is equal to the minimum, so if we're on 2014, then set the value to 0. So this gives us our graph where everyone is baselined at 0. Otherwise, we look at the growth in net income and put it into a folder called benchmark analysis. We've got loan to asset ratio, and we've got current ratio. So again, looking at assets and liabilities, and we've also got return on assets. So these we've just defined as a format string. I did say I was going to come back and show you format strings, and again, a much easier way to apply it rather than through the tabular editor is rather than through Power BI Desktop, is to use tabular editor to select all of the currency values if you like, and then it says for each measure selected, give it the format string with negative numbers shown in brackets with a pound symbol, and so it gives us the numbers and the formats that we want. So we can just apply these to all the measures if we just select all of our currency ones. Where it's not currency, so say in script 4, we can define the format string as part of the measure creation, just define it as a percentage. So this then gives us our ratios, and if we look at Power BI Desktop and we look at step 3 there, we then create the visualizations for those. So what we do with this is use field parameters. So we say new parameter fields, and then all these ratios, so these are essentially our ratios, and we want to have our ratios as a slicer. So we essentially then pick our ratios measures. So if we pick in here, benchmark analysis, current ratio, loan to asset, net income growth, return on assets, click add slicer to page. That's going to give us these with our table with benchmark ratio there. And this is the DAX it generates with field parameters. And now with these, then we can then use, we have the benchmark ratio on the y-axis, the year on the x-axis here, and break it down legend is bank. And similar thing we do for all of the other graphs there. So just using field parameters there to be able to make this benchmarking report much easier. And our second tab there was financial statements. So here now we have then financial statements for all of the banks and our income statement and our balance sheet. So this is really what we did in the previous step, just neatened it up, created field parameters for our ratios that we've created in our tabular editor script, and now we can just piece those together in visualization. So if I go back into here, so the third step was to calculate ratios and build our benchmarking page. So the step here is to create our key ratios, so things like net income growth, loan to asset ratio, and I've just copied the DAX here for ease of reference. So our loan to asset ratio is our total loans over our total loans and assets. So what proportion of loans is of our total asset base is loans. And the current ratio is looking at, we're only looking here actually loans and deposits. We're assuming those are the only two current assets and current liabilities. It's just your current assets being your business and consumer loans, and your current liabilities being your deposits, and then just doing the ratio of one over the other. We've then got a field parameter that we set up in Power BI Desktop. Set up the the field parameter, and this creates the DAX table with our measures, and then we just create the visualization here as well. So the script 4 that we ran for the ratios, field parameters, and our visualization. So we use the bank dimension field as a legend or small multiple, and we make sure we use the colors consistently on each graph. We have a multi-select slicer here to select a fewer number of banks if we want. And for the growth measure, so for net income growth, we started each bank with the same baseline of 0%. So that was when we did our net income. If the current year is equal to the minimum year, then it's 0. Otherwise, we look at the growth. So that gives us our graph that all has the same starting point and extends out from there. So now, lastly, we're going to look at what if parameters. So what we can do here, firstly, is actually we brought in our headcount data. So we'll come back to this. So what we have here is headcount metrics, and actually we're not using these for this one. Actually, we're actually just using this what if parameters for here. So the first thing we're doing in here is going into the parameters, so modeling new parameters, and this time we're doing numeric range. So we're giving it a name, saying I put a $sign to kind of indicate that it's a what if. That's the prefix I'm using there. So what if, and here we'll say headcount, and we'll do the same thing for loans and the same thing for deposits. So let's just only assume positive in this case. Obviously, we could do negative growth as well. We could do minus 100 to 100. I'm just going to do here 1 to 100, whole number, increment. And now this just gives us a table with the values of 1 to 100 with a slicer that we can put in here for our what if headcount. So we do the same thing for our headcount, for our loans, and for our deposits. So this is what we then do in here. So we've got our what if deposits, and again it's just created a DAX here for generate series. We've got what if headcount, and we've got what if loans, and all of those are then our what if parameter model. So just going to modeling, new parameter, and numeric range. We then create some measures based on those. So now if we just open up our last measure script, so measure script 5, so this is for our modeled value. So the other thing, sorry, just I forgot to mention there, is we just create a blank table, just an empty enter data table with 2 values in it, just called modeled and original. So our scenario just has modeled and original. We then actually apply in here, we just have 2 copies of the income statement and the balance sheet. And in this table, we just apply a visual level filter for scenarios original, and this one, a visual level filter for scenarios modeled. And same with the balance sheet. And that's just a disconnected table here. This table scenario here is just a disconnected table there, so we don't need to do anything with it, but we'll pick it up in our DAX logic. So what we do here now is we say, look at the scenario that's in scope, so i.e. that's been applied through the visual level filter. By default, if nothing is selected, let's just assume it's original. So is it modeled? Just check whether it's modeled, whether that scenario is actually modeled. So the default value is our total amount. We don't need to use the FS line value here because we know that the lines that we're modeling, like staff costs, loans and deposits, they are by nature FS lines. We're not going to model a subtotal or something like that. So we're just, our default value is always going to be just the total amount, the sum of value. And our loans growth value is what we've selected in our slider, our what if parameter slider. And then we just say if it's modeled, take our default value, our total amount, and grow it by the parameter value that we've selected in here divided by 100. So if we select 50, it will grow it by 50%. Otherwise, if it's the original scenario, then just give us the default value. So that's what the same pattern that we can use for all 3 of those. So we say model deposits and modeled staff costs. So again, look at staff costs if it's original or modeled. Look at what we've got as our parameter value that we've selected in our slicer, and then if it's a modeled value, then grow it by the slider value. Otherwise, give us the original. So we just create those 4 measures there, and then when we come back in here, we just have the sliders in here. So now we have for FS modeling, we have headcount growth, and then here this is then looking at FS modeling. And I think the last thing we needed to do on there was actually just update. I just go back to the script The last thing I needed to do there was say FS modeled value, which was one of the, in our original FS line switch statement, if FS modeled value. So we originally just put this as total amount. Now we're replacing total amount with actually the modeled value that we've got here that looks at whether its scenario is original or modeled. So now we can just use again our original FS line value, and we've got our scenario modeling values in here. So we've got our modeled loans, modeled staff costs, modeled deposits, and we've got then in our core FS measures, our FS line value is referring, where it's a modeled FS line, it's referring to the FS modeled value, which again is just picking up what's the modeled value. If it's staff costs, give me the staff costs modeled value. If it's loans, give me the modeled loans. If it's deposits, give me the modeled deposits. So now we've got these here, and as we change these, we can see the numbers changing between here, applying to this one, the modelling uplift as well. And again, now we've just got two versions of that, and we've just got bookmarks here to be able to switch between them. So actually creating the bookmarks is quite easy as well. We can create buttons, a navigator, and then a bookmark navigator. So rather than creating them individually, buttons for every single bookmark, we can just create a bookmark navigator, put these bookmarks in a group, put these bookmarks in a group, and then it allows us to switch between them. So that functionality makes it a lot easier. So if we just go back now, so the what if parameters for scenario modeling, we had what if field, so we created again numeric range parameters, so deposits, headcounts and loans, and staff costs, all numeric range parameters from 1 to 100, and they're shown as a slice on the page. We then had a script to create our measures for the modeling, and then we just created 2 copies of them, created just a slicer on each one to say if it's scenario, if it's modeled, and then we had a look at what we have in there, disconnected table with originally modeled, and updated the FS modeled measure. So those were our kind of 4 key steps. Just to summarize where we've got to the steps that we've gone through to be able to do this. So the first step we did was to ingest and model data. So we took our Excel file, our accounts data, our trial balance, we put that onto SharePoint along with our FS lines file, our metadata file, and we accessed those through SharePoint and just brought them into the data model. We then unpivoted the accounts data, so rather than having years along the top, we've got all the years in a single column, and we just joined back on our dimension tables that we created, so just blank tables with our banks names in them, blank table with our year names on them, and our fact table ended up with just being those keys and the value. So FS line number, bank ID, year, and value were the only columns left in our fact table. We then used tabular editor scripts just to quickly be able to create all the measures. So in the first script, we created our FS line value, our core measure that we're using in our income statement and balance sheet, but we just created them with blank measures underneath with a switch statement. So it looked at the calc type, and for now we just created blank measures as placeholders. And then in script 2, we populated the category total and the running totals for those calc types, for calc types 2 and 3. And then we also created all the balance sheet measures, so all the balance sheet calculated values like total assets, total liabilities, average equity, retained earnings, all of those in that script for in tabular editor script 3. That then gave us what we needed for our financial statements, so all of our calculated values, all of our category totals, running totals, and we were able to then create the income statement and balance sheet, which actually fed off each other. So in the income statement, retained earnings is the bottom line, that is the subtotal of everything above it, including profit after tax less dividends, and that retained earnings goes into our balance sheet under a retained earnings account on our balance sheet, which is the cumulative retained earnings. It's what we're using for funding our business along with shareholders' equity and debt. We then we had a balancing figure in there as well to make sure that our assets are being funded by liabilities and equity. So total assets equals total liabilities and total equity. And we had a balancing figure there, I guess a liability in this case, to actually show, to make sure that those numbers balance. So we then created our ratios, so net income growth, loans to deposits ratio, current ratio, and built the benchmarking page using field parameters. So using parameters, field parameters, to be able to switch between those measures, and then use that on the axis of our charts and in a slicer. And then lastly, we created another set of parameters, this time not field parameters, but just what if normal numeric range parameters from 1 to 100 for loans, deposits and staff costs, and then created a modelled version of those measures to be able to then compare what happens if we increase loans or deposits or headcount year on year. So thank you for watching. I hope that's been useful. I'll make these scripts and the recording along with the recording available on my website, so rishisupra.com. Please visit there if you want to download this and give this a try yourself.